Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. I have no idea what episode number this is, but I do have some really interesting books to talk about. I feel like this selection of books, like they're all like really unique books. I think I just read like some really interesting kind of weird stuff. This was basically like my quarantine reads. Like this is what I started reading, I think like right at the beginning of quarantine, so like mid-March, and read up until maybe like end of May, I think. I don't really remember. Time is an illusion that I don't understand and that I don't partake in. The first book that I read was Indelicacy by Amina Cain. This is about a woman who like used to work in an art gallery, I think as a cleaning lady, but like she wants to be a writer, and it's mostly about her, it's a lot about her marriage, but also like this friendship that she has. It's very hard to explain, there's not really a story. I really like this book conceptually and like what it's trying to do. I like that the narrator is meant to feel ghost-like, but I thought the writing was so vague. And on one hand, maybe that was like a stylistic choice that's meant to be in unison with the themes, but to me, it just made it really hard to connect to the writing. Very vague prose, like non-specific prose. There weren't really a lot of specific details, so I just didn't find it to be like a rich reading experience. I see how maybe that was trying to emulate the narrator's experience, that ghostly feeling, but it didn't really work for me. Because the main character wants to be a writer, I'll be honest, I normally don't like writing about writing. I find it hard to pull off. This like need that she had to be a writer was talked about so much without any like concrete backing for why it was important to her or what it meant to her. I like the idea of the very sparse prose and sparse characterization even, but it didn't work for me. So the next book that I read, I adored. I read My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, who is an author that I adore. I've talked about how I loved her book Eileen. I haven't read her new release yet, but I'm really excited for it. She's kind of like my current writer obsession, like writer crush, where I'm just like obsessed with her writing. Every once in a while, do you just like find a writer that you vibe with? Like you're on the same page. I feel like I'm on the same page as Ottessa Moshfegh. Like we get each other, or I get her work. I don't know if she gets me. This is a novel about an unnamed character. She lives kind of a cushy life in New York. She has a large inheritance. She has a really easy job also at an art gallery, like 2 art gallery books in a row. I don't know what's up with me, but she's just not content with her life. She's just not happy, and she doesn't really know why, and so she kind of decides that she wants to sleep for a year. She wants a break from life. Gets in touch with like the worst, least qualified psychiatrist that she can find, and basically just lies to her to get the psychiatrist to give her like as many sleeping pills as possible so that she can try to sleep as often as possible for a year. I loved seeing such a high concept play out in such a realistic way. Like the story really takes this really wacky concept and treats it as if it was realistic. And it's not that the story necessarily feels realistic, because it feels dreamy. The book really does capture that feeling of being between asleep and awake. It feels like a lucid dream. I think Ottessa Moshfegh is also just like the queen of unlikable characters, which I have huge respect for, because that's what I also love to write. The main character is not a likable person, but she is fascinating. She is so interesting to read about. It grabbed my attention from the first page and just never let it go. My attention was never dropped. I was consistently captivated throughout the entire book and drawn into this dreamy, hypnotic, trance-like feeling. It was a fascinating character study. As someone who loves sleep, like I have referred to sleep as my hobby before, I found this to just be like a huge mood. Relatable content. So then I read a collection, Verge by Lidia Yuknavitich. This was a really solid collection. Pretty peculiar. The stories are all very punchy and bold and vibrant. Every story is very distinct, high intensity, bold concept stories, and I really like that in a collection. There were a few that were so ungrounded. Is that a word? So not grounded? I don't want, whatever, words. So ungrounded that I didn't know what was going on, like in some of the really short pieces, but especially the longer pieces I really enjoyed here. There was this weird thing that the author did a couple times where like she would point of view shift like outside of the story to like herself, kind of, which like I've seen Margaret Atwood do that before. I've never been a huge fan of the technique when at the end or near the end of a story, the author just like for one sentence inserts their own narrative. This was definitely a solid collection and probably one of my favorite collections that I've read in quite a while. So the next book that I read was The Cure for Death by Lightning by Gail Anderson-Dargatz. So I picked this up because it's like my book. When I heard about this and when I read the summary, I was kind of shaken because the plot and the specific details were so similar to my novel that I have written, and I was a little freaked out by that. So this book follows a young woman named Beth. I think she's 15. She lives in a small town in BC. I think it's during World War II. It's really the only thing that separates it from my own book, because my own book is post-World War II, and she gets struck by lightning. That happens in my book. So when I heard that this book existed, I was like, oh my god, I have to read this to make sure that I didn't accidentally, subconsciously plagiarize an entire book that I hadn't read. I enjoyed this. Conceptually, like I said, it's really similar to my book. It doesn't play out the same way, obviously, because people's brains are different, and that would just logistically never happen. I found this to be really rich in detail. The detail of the setting and the characters' just like livelihoods is so richly painted. I really enjoyed it. There are a lot of really interesting side characters surrounding Beth. This is a deeply Canlit book. Like, I've never read something more Canlit than this. Like, this is Canlit with a capital C. Everything about it. Like, it's been adapted into a play. That's how Canlit this book is. It's pretty slow paced. The actual story is quite subtle. It almost felt like more of a portrait of a place and a character and how she was feeling at that time rather than like necessarily a plot. I don't know. I read this really slowly because I was in a huge reading slump, and now I kind of forget what happened. So then I read Wash's Praise by Noor Naga. This is a verse novella, so it's written in a series of prose poems. It's quite short. I read this in one sitting. So I picked this up because Noor is the fiction editor of The Puritan. So I worked with her on 2 stories, and I think she is the loveliest person. And I wanted to support her and read her book because she's a fantastic editor, and I figured I would probably like her book. And I did. I loved it. This book follows Cuckoo, who is a young, I think she's like in her early or mid-20s Egyptian immigrant living in Toronto, and she ends up having an affair with one of her professors who is married. It kind of tackles how this series of events makes her question kind of her place and also her faith. I found the way that language was used and stylized in this piece to be, for lack of a better word, joyful. Like, seeing language used so uniquely and brightly and creatively, but also with like so much like technical constraint and control it's like joyful to read, I think. Maybe it's just me like being a writer and someone who loves like writing craft, but I found it like stunning. This book is written in a series of prose poems, and the way that she both controls and subverts like linguistic expectation, like, I just want to like dance. The form was really, really unique, and the way the form kind of tracked the character transformation was really, really beautiful. The next book that I read is probably the book that I'm the most excited to talk about in this video. So then I read Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen by Marilyn. I heard about this from Kaiming Chang, who is a poet that I adore. Posted an article that was like book recommendations based on your Chinese zodiac sign. I'll leave a link to it because I got so many good recommendations from that blog post. It was a gift to this earth. I don't even know where to start with this. This book is vibrantly alive and crackling with energy. It's fun, it's strange, it's like a funhouse carnival fever dream on LSD. There were a lot of moments where I was like wowed because of how vibrantly strange they were. Like, I think there were multiple times we were reading it, I just like laugh. I like ascended. Also, the grandmother, if you read this book, you know what I'm talking about. The grandmother is the greatest character in the entire literary canon. Changed my mind. It's playful, raucous, bold, unexpected. I didn't really talk about what this book is about because it's hard to define. Basically, we follow these twins, Mooney and Mei Ling. We follow them through various myths, fables, moments from their lives. It's like a jigsaw puzzle kind of. While reading, I was a little distracted by not really understanding how the stories fit together in terms of logic and time. But after I finished the book, I did some research and I kind of learned that they actually aren't really meant to. This book is really based on like the Buddhist history and mythology, and I am an uneducated plebeian who doesn't know anything about Buddhism. But I'm really glad that I did the research on the book and the author's intention, because I I adored the book while I was reading it. It's not like my appreciation for it came later, but I really was able to just like see what she was going for and understand that. So I actually do have a couple recommendations for how to read this book. If you want to read it normally, obviously with a book, you open it, you read it all the way through. This one, I kind of have some recommendations. Obviously, if you have that background knowledge, ignore what I'm saying, but I think there's a lot of richness that comes from being able to understand like the illusion. I would recommend before you read the book to read the author's note at the back first. It's not going to spoil the book. She lists all of the like folkloric or mythological illusions in her author's note. I recommend referencing that as you read. So every time you finish a little story in the book, go read up on the illusions. I think there's so much richness to be gained there that if I'd known that that was there, that's how I would have read the book. But I didn't know that until the end. And then also just her author's note kind of lays out what she's doing with the structure so that you're not left feeling confused about how the pieces fit together, because the pieces of this book, like this book is told in a lot of stories and they're not even of the same reality. Like they don't really necessarily take place in the same reality. I wanted to read this note from her author's note because I found it really interesting. So this is kind of what she lays out in her author's note. She says, the structure of this book is based on ancient Buddhist beliefs in reincarnation and the eternal cycles of suffering. The characters are all trapped in a vicious cycle of reincarnation. The cycle of suffering is continuous. The oppression of women is continuous. Fleshy desire, which leads to suffering, is continuous. Mooney and Mei Ling appear to be well-adjusted adolescents, narcissistic, hard-working, high achievers on their way to acquiring the American dream. When they will reach enlightenment or self-realization, though, is unclear. They are, as all human creatures are, on a picturesque quest towards happiness. So that's kind of like what the structure of the book is doing and exploring. So then I read a book that was a little disappointing. The Falconer by Dana Czapnik. This is a pretty realistic story about a teenage girl growing up in New York during the 90s, and she's like in love with her best friend. I thought it was gonna be like some artsy shit, so I was looking for some inspiration for the book that I'm writing because it's some artsy shit. I found this to be quite underwhelming. I will say I thought the writing was great. I really enjoyed the prose. There are some really cool experimental passages that I really liked. But on the whole, I was just underwhelmed by the storyline. You know, I found myself asking, like, what happened? What was accomplished? When I got to the end. And near the end, there's a quote that I will read to you. This doesn't really spoil anything. There's this line that I got to near the end that reads, I didn't get a happy ending, but nothing really tragic or even vaguely sad happened either. There wasn't a loaded consequence. Nothing grand or important came of it. I fell in love with a boy and he didn't love me back, and that's pretty much the whole story. When I read that line, which is in the last chapter, I felt like the story just admitted to me that nothing happened and nothing was accomplished. But then like the story literally kind of validated the fact that this is a little inconsequential. I did feel like this was kind of trying to be like adult and YA simultaneously in this really strange way. It's like a young adult storyline written in an adult style. And I don't know how well those things jive or really what the intended audience is. This underwhelmed me, but I did really enjoy the prose. So then I read some poetry, Dunk Tank by Kayla Czaga. She guest spoke in one of my classes and she's just super lovely, so I was excited to read her book. This was very like relatable, humble, honest poetry, very personal. I found it to be like funny even sometimes. This is really focused around the high school period of life and transition into college, so like young adulthood. I related a lot since that's like a pretty recent part of my life. I think it's a really approachable, funny, honest, genuine group of poems. I felt like the author was like giving me access to something very personal. So then I read Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. It's been recommended to me time and time again. I've never heard someone say a negative thing about this book. Like, this is probably one of the most widely acclaimed books I've encountered in terms of everyone I know recommending it to me and loving it. So for that reason, I feel bad in saying that I didn't really like it. This is a dystopian novel. It's greatly rooted in mystery, so I won't say much about it, and I assume that like a large percentage of you guys have read it, probably loved it. I'm probably wrong. I feel like I have to be wrong here. We follow the main character who is reflecting on her time in a strange boarding school in the English countryside. I won't really say more because I think this book is about the slow unveiling of what's going on. It's written in such a conversational tone that I found it hard to connect to. The style is so casual that there isn't any line level tension, or in that case like scene level tension. The book is so reflective and so narrative, and then when that narrative doesn't have a lot of tension or like energy, I found it just hard to invest in. I thought the twist was fairly clear. Obviously I didn't call all of the like specificities of it, but I think I caught on to what was going on fairly early. I think part of the issue for me is that all the stuff that's interesting is so in the background. The story to me felt bogged down by a lot of mundane day-to-day context that was just kind of inconsequential to the story in the end. I just feel like this is a book that everyone loves, and I have to be like, it won the freaking Nobel Prize, so I'm sorry. So the final book that I have to talk about is one that I also really enjoyed, The Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. This book examines a friendship between two women who are both musicians in the social media age. And it kind of looks at how all of these things like social media, art, gender intersect with race in a really like nuanced but also like satirically poignant way, I guess. We have these two musicians, Neela and Rukmini. So Neela is like kind of an established musician. Rukmini covers one of her songs, and this kind of draws them together into a friendship, and then how their friendship is basically destroyed by a subtweet. I normally don't enjoy reading books about the internet because normally I think books about social media and the internet just have really weak takes. They're like, wow, amazing how social media is destroying our attention spans. And it's like, I've heard this, but this book, what I think was different, it went so many layers deeper and actually looked at and showed rather than told how social media affects your psychology, can instill these feelings of paranoia and loneliness and jealousy in you. And it was clearly written like Vivek Shraya gets the internet. I do think you have to be kind of like internet fluent to enjoy this. The conflict is so rooted in like Twitter, but it's done, I think, realistically, and sometimes it's like heightened a little for satire, but the thing about when you're writing about social media is like, if it sounds over the top, it's probably realistic. The characters I really enjoyed. They're flawed, but they're not asking to be liked, which I thought it was interesting because it's like actually kind of the antithesis of social media and like what the book was commenting on in terms of social media. I read this super quickly, I think like basically like 1 or 2 days. If you spend a lot of time on Twitter and are into intersectional feminism, I think that you would really like this. I think my only quibble was just that some of the side characters weren't that developed. After reading this book, I got my screen time report the next week, and it was the lowest that it has ever been. It was like, your screen time is down to like 31 minutes a day. When has my screen time been that low? Never. And it was actually genuinely because of this book, reading the book, and I was like, wow, does spending time on Twitter make me happy? I don't actually enjoy the time I spend on Twitter. It's not like it's fun, I don't enjoy it, it's just something that I do. So ever since reading this book, it actually genuinely made me reflect on like social media and my own thought patterns and how it makes me feel in a way that normally I find like articles about the internet fail to connect with me because they just are lacking nuance in that respect. This one actually like made me think, and since then I've basically been just like going on Twitter and going on Instagram just each once per day. Like I go on it once per day, I check what's up, and then I don't, instead of just like checking it constantly throughout the day and having it be like this constant factor. So yeah, this actually genuinely made me reflect and actually even like change my behavior. And I think it's been good for me. Shout out to this book for helping me have healthier internet habits. Alright guys, that's all I've got for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your favorite book you've read lately was. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video.